Everyone's all here. Thank you guys for joining us this evening. My name is Macy. Before we begin, Ron, I was just hoping that I could briefly kind of share how our little group got started and kind of what our goals have been. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were initially really interested by the early reporting that we saw of the racial disparities in COVID, both in infection and disease outcomes. And so our group initially started by kind of reading more in epidemiology and sociology papers with an initial focus on kind of looking at the role of race and structure and other social factors. However, as our group kind of progressed, we turned to a more literary approach and we began to kind of think about the role of stories in hopes of growing our own public and moral imaginations as aspiring physicians. And I think that something we all kind of agreed upon from reading your book was just, this is really a beautiful story about, threads and many, many stories. And we really appreciated the ways in which you kind of challenge both historical and contemporary ideas of whose stories matter. So I just kind of wanted to frame that before we started. Our group's kind of small today. Do you guys want to go around really quick and just say hi, and then I'll pass it off to Michael to introduce Ron? Okay. Johnny, why don't you go first really quick? Just say hi.
Hi, thank you Ron for being here. I'm Yannis Abram, I go by Johnny, and I'm a student at South Pacific University.
Ashvin?
Yeah, hi, I am Ashvin Matharu. I recently graduated from my university.
Okay, Bryn?
Hi, I'm Bryn. I'm a senior at Washington State.
Okay, Smith?
Hi, I'm Smith. I'm a sophomore at Harvard University, and sorry I'm laying down in bed. I just got surgery 2 days ago, so I'm on a machine.
Oh, here. Hope you get better.
Thank you.
August?
Hi, my name is August, and I'm a senior in high school.
Great.
Keith?
Hi, I'm Keith, and I'm a sophomore at the Overlake School.
Liz?
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz. I'm a junior at St. John's University. It's nice to meet you all.
Awesome. Caroline, are you able to say hi?
Sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulties, but I'm Caroline and I graduated a couple years from McGill University and currently working in clinical trials.
Awesome. Okay, Michael.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael. I graduated from Seattle Pacific University in 2020. And yeah, so I'm gonna introduce our guest speaker, Ron Chu. So Ron Chu was born and raised in Beacon Hill, a suburb of Seattle, and he attended Franklin High School and then went on to the University of Washington, and he attended from 1971 to 1975, and he majored in editorial journalism. And then at the school, he worked as a student reporter at the Daily. And then afterwards, he went on to work at the International Examiner newspaper in the International District with a focus on community journalism. And he wrote about issues within the International District, such as poor housing, difficult access to healthcare, and threats to the International District from redevelopment. And then in 2001, he was appointed by Bill Clinton to the National Council on the Humanities. And Chu also became the Wing Luke Museum's director in 1991. And he transformed it from a struggling artifact-based museum into a community-based museum with collaborative projects. And then he helped raise $23 million to purchase and renovate the East Yong Kik building, which is where the Wing Luke Museum is today. And she has also served as the executive director of the ICHS, International Community Health Services, from 2010 to 2020, which helped serve a diverse Asian population. And then I thought we should start out with a quote from the book, which kind of will help guide our discussion. So I'm going to read that right now. And then here we go. My mother found out about my discrimination case from my father. She confronted me at home one weekend, asking why I hadn't told her. I didn't have a suitable answer. I remained silent. I understood why you did this, she said. I know about discrimination. That is the way it is in America. The Boguilo have more power than you. Remember that they're going to find a way to attack you. You are not safe. I've been so worried that I can't sleep at night. You have to be very careful from now on. She was probably right to be concerned. I received an anonymous, hate-filled racist phone call at my campus apartment. I hung up right away. A stranger on a bus who had seen the news coverage of my case came up to me and asked if I was the one who had accused the UW Daily of racism. When I said I was, he began to lay into me with an expletive-laden rant. I quickly moved away and stepped off the bus. So I wanted to start off with this passage because it shows how you encountered racism and fought it, but also felt the effects of being ostracized, not only in the community, but also the journalism community. So I wanted to start off with a question like, what advice would you give for us, hopefully young professionals advocating for change, but we might also face the same consequences that you faced in the past?
Well, first of all, thank you all for taking time to have this conversation. I'm always excited when I'm able to interact with folks who read my book. I thought in terms of the introduction to the book, which I'm forgetting, was it Macy? Who is the person? Yeah. That was a very thoughtful way of describing the book, because clearly you sort of grasped what it was all about and what I was trying to do. So again, it's actually a privilege for me to be here. And then to be with younger folks who represent the vision and future of our community as all of you begin preparing for your careers in the medical field. You know, each generation faces its own challenges. For me, as the child of an illegal immigrant, back in my era, my father and grandfather came here illegally because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I'm the child of illegal immigrants, which then meant we were living in the shadows. So it's a very complex kind of situation when you can't really assert who you are. And then you're tiptoeing around trying to deal with discrimination that faces you in a society back in that era, which was much more segregated, and for families like mine, which didn't have access to healthcare, you know, it was a hard place to be. I think for me, you know, looking back on those many years of growing up and pursuing my career ambitions, I always never forgot where I came from and the circumstances that my parents faced and my grandparents in creating a life here. So it's always about just remembering your past and then centering yourself in that way. Then it was about figuring out where your passion is. And despite whatever obstacles there are, being clear that that's what you want to do with your life. For me, you know, I entered journalism because I wanted to be a writer. I loved words. I loved being able to tell stories about people I grew up around, including my father, who worked as a waiter, including my mother, who was a sewing woman. You know, that was my community. And so I wanted to be a writer. So that was my dream, and I pursued it. Took me into community journalism, as Michael mentioned, and later to the museum, where it was another place I could share stories, and then to healthcare. The International Community Health Services community-based clinic. There are many in neighborhoods around the country that are especially important in communities of color. I had the opportunity to help raise money and support services for folks who represent a different generation of immigrants, sometimes also facing backlash of policymakers who don't really want them here, but making sure that they're healthy and that they know that they have a right to health care. So keeping yourself centered, having a vision and dream, and then following that dream, you know, are sort of basic things that I think all of you, you know, are pathways to success for all of you.
Thank you for that. We really appreciate you being able to be with us tonight and to share that. It's really nice to hear you talk about it. I mean, just to kind of like start us off, I think you touched on it a bit just in what you were saying, but kind of thinking about towards the end of the book, I think it's chapter 69, when you talk about kind of making the decision to return to community work as the director at ICHS. And then you also kind of briefly touched about your mother's own experiences at the clinic, both in helping her understand her health-related government forms and bills, as well as her experience with Dr. Chemo, who helped ease her final transition. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit more and how your experiences have led you to become interested in healthcare and the health of your community and how these experiences might have informed your book.
Yeah, well, when I was at the University of Washington studying journalism, that was back in the period of the 1970s, early 1970s. It was the height of the civil rights movement. All of us baby boomers, many of us first generation college attendees, there was a lot of social upheaval. Similar to what's been happening in this current time period. It's funny how history keeps repeating in cycles, and of course the backlash and so forth. But I was at the time I was attending University of Washington. I was also working at a restaurant where my dad was a waiter, and I saw that the folks working there didn't have any health care. And in fact, there was no sick leave, no benefits. My dad worked in a number of years, 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day for $1 an hour. No sick leave, no overtime, nothing. So there was very harsh conditions. They also didn't have any health care. So you went to work when you were sick, because if you didn't go, you didn't earn any money.
Right.
And so, when I got involved in covering a lot of the activism during that time period, I came back down to my community, and it all kind of connected for me. And I knew at some point I might enter healthcare. In some arena, and I eventually did during the tail end of my career. But it was just really about trying to make sure that people around me, including my parents and relatives, got to see a doctor, because you didn't go to see a doctor in those days. You didn't have bilingual, multilingual, culturally sensitive care. You worked until you died. So as a 13, 14-year-old working in the restaurant, I saw people literally dying. There was somebody who worked in the kitchen who, became more and more jaundiced and thin. He had cancer. He eventually died when he couldn't work anymore. I saw that with one of the waiters. So, as a teenager, young teen, it was kind of hard to see. There was something not right about this situation where people can't get something as basic as healthcare. And in the community in which the restaurant was located, the Chinatown community, I had relatives living in the hotels, and nobody visited them. Many of them were isolated because of the exclusion laws. They couldn't bring their wives over, so they were bachelor men living out their remaining years. And it wasn't until some of the volunteers at the International Community Health Services Clinic went up to visit them that they might discover their body, and which may have been they may have died, a week or two earlier, without anybody to check. So yeah, so again, the field that you guys are involved in, and Macy, to your question too, and I appreciate all of you pursuing this. Healthcare is a basic kind of thing, and you can make a huge difference, in using your knowledge and some awareness and sensitivity to those you serve, in making things better for folks. That's a little rambling kind of thing. I don't know
No,
if that.
thank you. That was really great to hear that.
Yeah, thanks, Ron, for coming out. So I have a question based on the tangent of healthcare. So on pages 62 to 63, you mentioned that there are different concoctions in your mother's kitchen cabinet that you didn't ask about, such as like a baby might soaking in alcohol. And you mentioned that your mother had deer testicles and deer antlers. And I know that in a lot of elderly Chinese populations, they have these Chinese medicinals, like the to chai pills and Camu herbal tea that are given for illness. And I see like there's this dichotomy between like westernized medicine and like traditional like Chinese medicine. And I know that this is like the case for a lot of minorities or immigrant communities. So how do you see traditional Western medicine intersecting with these different herbs and stuff that potentially might not be as effective? And how do we confront the issue of the conflicting ideologies in terms of healthcare?
Yeah, that's something I think all of you are probably aware of, but is a topic worthy of further exploration. Again, back in my era when I was growing up, there was a huge dichotomy, as you mentioned, Michael, between traditional Eastern medicine and Western medicine. And if you went to your regular traditionally Western trained medical provider, they didn't understand or even accept a lot of the herbal treatments that we used in the home. In fact, they had no clue what all that stuff was. And so that was kind of hidden from view. Also, during that time period, people trained in Eastern medicine were not licensed. And so they actually were sort of practicing under the table, and many members of the Chinese community they had to make a choice, either go Western or the traditional. I think over time, when I joined International Community Health Services, there was a greater appreciation, because finally we had some trained Asian physicians and medical providers working in that arena. So they understood and could figure out, for example, hey, it's not one or the other. You can use both in combination. And then it takes a certain skill to also figure out, well, how does acupuncture, intersect with, certain pharmaceutical prescriptions that might be recommended or prescribed by a Western trained doctor. So now there's a little more of kind of an understanding that there's something to take from the entire arena. I think as this country becomes more and more diverse, because now, of course, with the changeover in Afghanistan, you're going to have Afghan refugees coming, and how do you treat them? How do you respect their cultural practices, take the best of what they know and combine it with what the West has to offer as well? I should mention International Community Health Services serves, we have 11 different clinic sites in Washington State, and we don't simply serve Asian and Pacific Islander populations. We also serve large sectors of the East African community, the Native American community, Eastern European refugees, Russians, Latinx community members. So we're moving into an era in which a lot of this diverse knowledge has to come together in some kind of package that is appropriate for those folks you serve. And that'll be one of the things that I hope all of you bring to the table, is sort of just a willingness and appreciation to just kind of learn from your patients, those you're serving, and then really developing some cultural sensitivity as part of your study as you enter that field.
Yeah, that's pretty helpful. Like if we just incorporate a little knowledge about different cultures, we can assimilate it into our own practice, like potentially just more classes like informing us of these different cultures and how we can incorporate it, so there's less of a dichotomy and we can meet in the middle ground somehow.
Yeah, and I might mention too, even things like behavioral health, mental health, it's a very complex issue because in certain cultures it's just not understood or even grasped in the same way that we do here in the US. And then you're also dealing in many cases with these communities of color, refugees and recent immigrants who suffered the trauma of warfare, and the pressures of assimilation, discrimination, all kinds of issues that make providing appropriate health care a very complex endeavor.
All right, thanks, Ron.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ron. Also, we were thinking, in addition to cultural differences, how language can have an impact in receiving medical care. And I'm not a native English speaker myself, and I really resonated with chapter 49, My Mother's English Lessons, where you explain how determined your where you explain how determined your mother was in learning English, and how that also turned out to be positive for you in learning Chinese, as she would continuously translate English to Chinese and vice versa to better understand the meaning and pronunciation of words. And then you also, over time, became more confident in writing in Chinese, both names of your family members and the villages your relatives were from. And as you gain more confidence in writing in Chinese, you also write in page 413 that I eased into a new world of understanding. And as pre-professional students studying both disparities in health and healthcare, I was wondering if you could share your perspective on how healthcare professionals should ensure that language does not become a barrier to both access of best care and compassionate support, because not being able to fully comprehend the patient or the physician might compromise their the trust in their mutual relationship. But as you said, if there is language proficiency or understanding, there is also a new world of understanding which can be impactful when providing and receiving medical care.
Yeah. No, thanks for bringing that up, Johnny. I'm sure you're aware that there are certain things you just can't express when you move from one language to another, right? I mentioned in the book, just as one example, when I was growing up, Chinese, when you get sick and have a common cold, the term for it is xiangfeng, which literally translates as wind injury, because that's how it's viewed. But how do you, if you try to explain to somebody who's not part of the culture, like, well, what are you talking about? The whole concept of your body having a balance between hot and cold properties. Well, what is, a Western doctor say, well, how do you measure that? What the heck is that? Even the language, there's certain things that you can't translate. And so it's important to understand that, because even if you find the precise words, sometimes there are just no transition words between the two. They're just different ways of seeing the world that the language expresses. In terms of how to deal with that, it certainly helps to have people who are native speakers, who are healthcare providers, right? Who can just be the bridges. More and more now, with telehealth and, mandated interpreter services, things like that. There are opportunities to try to narrow that gap. But I think as folks in the healthcare arena, it's our obligation to take that step ourselves to try to increase that understanding. And certainly, I was in the fundraising arena in healthcare, and I was always pushing for government funders, private funders, corporations, foundations, to support this as an essential part of providing healthcare. It isn't simply an add-on that you pay for if the resource is available. It's absolutely necessary. And in this COVID-19 era that we're continuing to endure, where the impact of the virus has been so devastating on certain marginalized communities, it becomes all the more important to support those kind of interpretation services. So yeah, I think it starts with all of us being advocates, and then trying to be bridges if we can, because some of us do have second languages that we bring to the table, second or third languages.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Ron.
Thank you, Johnny.
Hi, I had a question on, so in chapter 38, you wrote a rare opinion article for the Examiner on the 1983 Wami Club murders, where on page 328, you stated that Willie Mack dragged Chinatown into court with him as an uncharged co-defendant, Willie Mack, seeking to disguise his testimony as confession past blame on a mythical Chinatown he fabricated out of half-truths and stereotypes that work best on those who know the least about Chinatown. As a result of the murders, Uncle Roy was assaulted and had to close the Hong Kong restaurant. Members in the community experienced harassment from the media, and the media was portraying Chinatown poorly with stereotypical articles, which resulted in a decrease in non-Asian customers. As a longtime devoted member to the International District and Seattle Chinatown community that has experienced the impacts of the 1983 murders and the impacts of the misinformation that was spread by the previous president in the American media about the origins of the coronavirus, did you see similar impacts, particularly in the mental health of those in the community? How have you seen these events impacting particularly the elderly in terms of their mental well-being? And how can we as aspiring healthcare physicians and providers better provide support to those in the Asian American community in times like these? So what kind of outreach or services do you think would be helpful for those who may not reach out for help themselves or too scared to?
Yeah, no, thank you for that thoughtful question, August. Yeah, sometimes you think you're making progress and you really haven't gone very far. I talked about the Wami murders back in 1983, where 13 gamblers were essentially assaulted in a robbery. Those kind of horrific situations really test both the media in terms of how it portrays things and then affects or reinforces people's attitudes. But it also kind of highlights the faults in our society and tensions and problems that are already there. So with the Wami murders, as you mentioned, community was pretty devastated. You know, everybody walking around Chinatown somehow became like either a thug or a hatchet man or some mysterious person. I even encountered it myself. I could hear I'm a reporter, my gosh, attending University of Washington. When I was working at the restaurant or going into the restaurants, you could hear, many of the non-Asian customers talking about folks in ways that were appalling. Reporters were sifting around the community looking for stories, and if somebody didn't speak English, they were reported as somebody who's trying to hide something. So they'd say, well, try to talk man on the street, but nobody would agree to talk to me. Well, they weren't talking to you because they couldn't speak English. So business was down. People were really stereotyped in a very negative kind of way. And again, Uncle Roy, somebody who I knew from the community, he's faced some attacks as a result of all that coverage that was going on. In this current time period, let me suggest, there's been a focus, as I'm sure you're aware, on the supposed rise in anti-Asian violence, attacks on seniors and Chinatowns around the country. And there's been a number of incidents even in Seattle, in the Chinatown International District, that I'm aware of even. I should mention, I'm a runner, so I run in the morning. I've been confronted by people during my runs, because they think I brought the virus, and so that people run around yelling at me. It's crazy. I'm glad that the media now is sort of focusing some attention on this, because what's happening is not right. Attacking our seniors, just beating them up because they think we're, like these foreigners, perpetual foreigners or whatever, bringing the virus is just really wrong. But I would argue that that's always been the case. We've always been seeing Asian Americans, in particular, have always been seen as perpetual foreigners. Doesn't matter how good the English you are that you speak, you're not American enough. I remember when I started working at the Wing Luke Museum, very subtle thing, but I was the director, and so often I was downstairs, handling matters. And people would come in looking for recommendations on a Chinese restaurant to go to, or looking to talk to somebody at the museum. But they would always look around, not at me, but they were looking for somebody else who wasn't Asian. It was kind of a strange thing. They wanted information about something related to the museum, and I had some white volunteers, and they'd always go to the white volunteers, and not to me. I don't know how they saw me. That changed over time. I was at the museum for 17 years, and I saw, a change during that time period for the good. But the attacks on the Asian seniors that we've been reported more recently, that's been happening all along. Chinatowns have always been areas where people have come in to create robberies because they figure, well, they can't report it to the police, or the police aren't going to respond. So I would argue that I'm not even sure there's necessarily been an increase. It's always been there, particularly in the Chinatowns, at least as far as I know. The seniors, within the community, it wasn't reported, but, the immigrant seniors have always been targeted because, they're weaker. They, they often carry cash and they often can't get 911 response, so I don't know that the world has changed much in that regard. I'm grateful that the reporting has highlighted this issue, but has there been an increase? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's always been there, but this is where, again, people can speak out, and those who enter or are working in the medical field certainly should pay some attention to those they serve, because often there's that hidden trauma of things happening day to day that they just don't report because they figure no one's gonna, why bring it up? No one's gonna do anything about it. So this huge underreporting. And I actually intervened in a number of situations, August, in which folks, this is actually on Beacon Hill, some families were targeted, racist attacks, and I was there for the police response, and the police response was very troubling because, number one, invariably didn't bring anybody who spoke Chinese, so, and they came, I would say, at a very casual pace, because it wasn't prioritized. And then I don't think, because I served to help interpret, I was looking at what they're writing down. It wasn't what, I tried to follow up, and then, I, because of at least my knowledge of system, I hounded the mayor's office. I called the police department. I said, need to follow up on this stuff. But absent all of you guys advocating, a lot of these things just, it's business as usual, and it's not the kind of response that, is equitable, because you're dealing with people who just don't have a voice.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Hi, so I have a question. Throughout your memoir, a prevalent theme was utilizing your voice when facing circumstances of injustice. And in your elementary school years, on page 70, you recount a time when a white administrator told you to ask your mother can you please tell her that if she wants to come inside the school, she needs to speak English, and then declining to respond to the administrator and your mother when she asked what the man said. Later on, when you were at the UW and filed a racial discrimination complaint, you expressed regret for speaking up for yourself on page 178 because you believed that speaking out negated all I had accomplished as a reporter in the eyes of prospective employers. And my outspokenness cost me a strong professional references. And looking back, what would you say to your younger self about using your voice? And what advice do you give to us as young people about using our voices to speak out against injustices we see in the classroom, in the clinic, and beyond?
Yeah, well, you have a voice, and it's a one thing that you got that's yours, and if you don't use it, it's a waste. I was in elementary school when that incident happened, where my mother was told not to enter the school unless she spoke English. Of course, she couldn't speak English, so then I became very embarrassed, and from that day forward, I made sure she didn't come into the school, because I was just humiliated. I was embarrassed. And I was too young to speak out for myself. It was very traumatic during my growing up years. I remember the incident so vividly, because again, my last class, every day I'd make sure to leave class early. I wasn't supposed to, but I left just because I didn't want her to come into the school. And I never explained to her what was going on because I was embarrassed. I didn't have any power. But growing up, at the University of Washington, when I faced discrimination in applying for a reporting job at the school newspaper and didn't get the position, I didn't really have an excuse. I'm an adult. I have a voice, and I have an obligation to speak out. And I think you'll find yourself in those situations too, where you have some authority, and you need to be an advocate. It's not in your job description usually, right? And you may just be simply, a healthcare provider or whatever. But when you see things and observe things, the most powerful thing is to have a voice. I could speak English. I became a writer. I had a voice. And I think eventually it made a difference because, after my discrimination complaint, the school newspaper came up with the hiring and firing guidelines for the first time. They were compelled to have job descriptions, to have a fair interview process. I paid a little bit of a price because I never got the job, and I got a small monetary settlement, and then I got blacklisted and ended up doing community journalism because I couldn't get hired by mainstream media. But I didn't look backwards. For me, it was a powerful moment because it was about claiming the voice that I had, and it was a voice that was given to me by my parents because they sacrificed to give me the opportunity to go to school. So yeah, I think these are things that to always keep in the front of mind, that you as one individual can make a huge difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Mr. Chu. I wanted to start off by saying, I hope you can hear me over the rain, but I want to start by saying that I can't tell you how much your book resonated with me, especially as someone who grew up in a Sikh household. We're Indians, and so especially the first 10 chapters of your book, I wrote all over the book, connecting so many similar nuances that reflected in Indian culture as well. And these things were like the small, things like immigrant parents working multiple jobs and shifts, hanging wet laundry on clothesline, buying oversized clothes so that they last longer, and then blaming the Western diet for everything. And there were so many things. I would be here for another hour if I could go on everything that resonated with me. Even the tiger balm, my family still keeps a small bottle in our medicine cabinet. And I also wanted to just quickly acknowledge and say thank you for including your section about the Sikh American exhibition at the Wing Luke Museum that was open in honor of the 9/11 heart of the hate crimes, and as well as your visit to the Renton Gurdwara, because that's the same Gurdwara that I go to with my family every week. So yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
there's just something so special about reading the same places and experiences that you've been to that I go to all the time. So yeah, I want to say thank you on that small piece. For me, that was a very heartwarming page to read, and I was like, oh, it's so sweet, because it's not often that a lot of other books cover Sikh history or even the 9/11 the hate crimes.
Yeah.
As to my question, I was actually pertaining to your stories of your numerous individuals that you connected with in Seattle. For me, the role of women in your memoir stood out on a few different levels. So on page 31, you share how your mother's father believed that it was a waste of money to educate a girl. Females were regarded as extra mouths to feed. And in China, women couldn't perform the same backbreaking physical labor as men, and so they're confined to housework and child rearing. And once grown, females would be married off to their families in other villages. And all of these things, and you also include a piece where, as a child, my mother heard fellow villagers talking about an unwanted baby girl who was brought to the woods and smothered under a pile of ashes. And I think I guess someone else, this is very startling, but for me, coming from an Indian background and our community, it's something that's actually quite casually brought up. And it's really tragic that that's the case. But I've also noticed that once there's an evident shift of when women, especially immigrant women, they come to America, they've given the opportunity to work and be involved in the same workforce as men, such as your mother and my parents. And it was really interesting to me how lots of Indian families, especially during that time period, they actually didn't allow their women to have jobs outside the house. So I thought it's very like interesting that your family was okay with that, and that your mom was actually working out in those factories. And then for me, like there was like this stark contrast when you presented your chapter on Tomo Shochi on page 273. She's like this woman who has this pizzazz, and she's like the center of the room, hand on one hip, head crooked to one side, wagging her finger. And she had like wit, humor, and insight. And so for me, like all these different ways of how women are presented, and given how much all Asian cultures value tradition and generational values, like I wanted to know what your thoughts are on how the role of women, especially in Asian communities, has changed, and how the role of a physician should or can be better to overcome those cultural barriers. Sorry, it's a long-winded question.
Well, first of all, Ashveen, you got to do a book too. There's a memoir sitting there someday, and I would just suggest, I pulled a lot. I was able to reconstruct a lot of my life because they kept journals in the 1970s and notes and other things. I'm not so much a material person, but for me, some of those encounters and observations were important to me, those stories. So I hope you're journaling or doing something or gathering information. You've probably got a book there. So I encourage you on that front. Isn't it ironic? And I think you picked up on it. A subtle theme of my book is the role of women. I mean, I didn't want to, there are a lot of subtle themes that I didn't want to like preach. I just want to tell stories, because through stories of how people endure, express themselves, create change, how they act, you see the power of what can happen when people commit themselves. I grew up in my mother, let's put it that way. My parents grew up in a very traditional Chinese, paternalistic, male-dominated society where women were really relegated to lesser positions. They don't get a chance to go to school because why educate them? They don't matter in the same way men do, right? They're treated as second-class citizens. They aren't paid the same amount. Their words are disregarded. We don't pay attention to them. They're the child bearers. I was intentionally trying to say, well, powerful characters in my book are mostly female, right? They're the ones that overcome and speak their mind and come to us with wisdom and compassion. The men make speeches, but beyond the speeches, anybody can make a speech, but I didn't need to say that. I just wanted to tell some stories, and through the stories, people could see the huge contradiction in how women have been kept down, but then have broken through. And to me, that's an amazing story. It's something to be proud about. It may not be, you talk about traditional culture, traditional values and so forth. What does that mean? What is the real evidence of how women and the role they've played in society? When I came to International Community Health Services, it was very interesting to me because the first directors were men. They were some of the advocates for the original funding. But over the years, as I worked there, I realized, well, all these healthcare providers, and even through the COVID-19 pandemic, the healthcare providers are all women. And I remember talking to Dr. Kimo Hirayama, the physician, longtime physician who's still at ICHS, who cared for my mother in her final days. He said, Ron, without the women, there'd be no ICHS. He said, because, the women are the ones who think about making sure the community is healthy. Men, do they go to the doctor even though they have access? No. Do they make sure their children go? No. So women, so that's huge. I bring that up because I think all of you in this healthcare arena are entering an arena where you can have a huge, huge difference. And you do it through your advocacy. You do it for caring for folks day to day, through expressing your cultural sensitivity and helping people. When I raised money for 10 years, the last part of my career for ICHS, people said, what keeps you going? How come you got back into healthcare and in this community stuff? Because I thought you didn't want to do any more fundraising. I said, well, I don't. But, I can go downstairs because my office is upstairs and the clinic is right there, and so I see people get, mostly women bringing their kids in for their shots. I see them taking care of medical conditions, the chronically ill seniors, so I don't need to look far to see why I'm there. I'm raising money to support this. How great is that? It's like it's an honor, a privilege to be doing this kind of work. So it's funny, Ashvin, I've forgotten your original question now, but I'm actually excited. Somebody like you coming into the arena, it's huge because there's some symbolism there too. When I went to lunch one day with the executive director and president of ICHS, we went to a restaurant down the street in the International District, and we ordered some food, and this mountain of food came out to the table, and the director says, where did all this food come from? I said, Teresita, they know we work at ICHS. So we got the greatest service. We got so much food. It was like, because I was there, because, the wait staff, they're all patients of ICHS. We take care of them. So yeah, it's a great journey. I'm just out of curiosity, what are your goals in terms of career-wise? What are you hoping to ultimately be?
I think we all here are aspiring physicians. I
Okay.
plan on applying to medical school next year. So yeah, we have a couple who've already applied and some are still in the process, but we're all on that same path.
Okay, great.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Thank you so much, Mr. Chu, for answering.
No, you're welcome.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could ask a question.
Okay.
Thanks. So excellent last name, by the way.
I like it, right? Don't you?
I really do. And I really wanted to thank you for taking time to be here. And I wanted to ask a little bit about if you could talk more about anti-Black racism in the Asian community. Just in my personal experience, there have been, in speaking with my grandma and, my, other elders in my community, I've kind of gotten a lot of disturbing comments about anti-Blackness. And I was wondering if you have, I guess, seen that as well, and what you think about, combating that and, kind of coming together. And I know, Black and Asian communities are very different, but also, like my Black friends say like, oh, like I would never swear to my mom. And I'm like, oh, I would never do that either, and there's, I think, a lot of like similarities in respecting and like the culture of respect and that kind of thing in the Black and Asian communities that I think, brings us closer together. But yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you've seen.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a lot of racism within all of our communities. I grew up among a number of Chinese community members who were extremely racist, extremely anti-Black, extremely anti-Native American, and they'd make comments very bluntly that were racist. I also grew up among folks who were more tolerant and understanding, and even folks who intermarried, and folks of mixed ancestry. I think all of us have an obligation to be bridge builders where we can. In some situations where it's pretty clear you're not going to change anybody's attitude, I don't really tend to waste my time getting into an argument. I think the greatest impact we can have is to model behavior that is appropriate and for us to be bridges. I grew up in a neighborhood where there are a lot of African Americans, Filipino kids, Japanese American kids, and Chinese kids, relatively few white kids. But we played together, we grew up together, we didn't necessarily visit one another's homes, because during that time period, it was kind of it was sort of a little bit of unspoken rule. You just kind of stayed, not going to go visit that African American home, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes, that rule was broken, it wasn't that big of a deal, but it was just sort of this unspoken kind of segregation that happened. As I grew up, working in the international district on a number of projects, the housing struggle that happened, a lot of the folks who were involved in helping were African American, Latino, Native American. So there are folks, interacting across boundaries. During that time period, remember, it's the civil rights era. So a lot of us who attend the UW, you had friends from different backgrounds. And I described that sort of another kind of subtle underpinning theme of my memoir, because you'll notice that it's a fairly diverse background that I grew up in, even though it was sort of Chinatown centric. It crossed over into friendships with folks from all different races and backgrounds. So, we have a multi-ethnic history, a history of collaboration across backgrounds, but we also have a very racist history too. I remember one of the waiters who worked at the restaurant that I worked at and my father worked at for the longest time. He was married to an African American woman, and they must have gotten married in the, oh boy, it must have been the 1940s or 50s, something like that. And there were a number of Chinese Americans like that who were married to non-Chinese, because there weren't a whole lot of women back in the era because of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right.
So either, were married to somebody in China who could never come over and start a family with you, or you married somebody else of some other ethnicity. So I remember after this waiter passed away, going to his funeral service, and there were very few people there, just because all his peers had passed away. But his widow was there. She was African American. I remember seeing her at some Chinese Family Association banquets, and there's some folks who made racist remarks, others who, did. The racist remarks, of course, they were always spoken in Chinese, but I knew it was. But it was very sad. I finally, at that juncture, got a chance to meet their daughter, a beautiful woman, very sweet, thoughtful. I never knew her during her growing up years. And in my mind, I wondered about her. I wondered what she had to endure growing up,
Right.
being a product of two.
And both.
Yeah. What sort of things she had to tiptoe around, et cetera, et cetera. And here again, Carolyn, I think we have an obligation to be the bridge builders and to, make people feel comfortable and to embrace their presence, to accept them as whole. But, we can also spur that kind of collaboration by simply highlighting times where our communities have intersected. When I did research on the Chinatown International District, I spoke to some of the Chinese seniors who are no longer around. They said, well, over on Waller Street, those are all African-American homes. I said, oh, really? I didn't know that. This is all Chinatown. I said, oh, no. And then you see the street over here that, we call the Chinatown core. This wasn't Chinatown core. This is Japantown, because there weren't very many Chinese because of the Exclusion Act. So all you had were a few gambling places. This was Nihon Machi, So we need to explore that. We need to find ways in which our histories intersected and overlapped, and then to promote that, because that's how we combat those divisions, those tendencies towards division. Right. And we're falling backwards because, again, we don't know a lot of that shared history. It really has been promulgated. Does that answer your question?
Very much so. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn. Anybody else?
Okay, I guess our discussion's wrapped up. I want to thank you so much again, Mr. Chu, for taking the time tonight to discuss your book with us. Your memoir clearly provides a lot of rich history, and this discussion has truly been a reflective experience for us, especially that will benefit us in our personal and pre-professional growth, as well as the aim to enter the healthcare field, being more empathetic and aware of American society and its multiple nuances. So thank you again so much.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. And good luck in your professional journey, and let's stay in touch. Yeah, success to you.
So Ron, I want to thank you, man. Reading this book and just listening in on your conversation with these young people has been very powerful and impactful. I mean, that sounds trite, but I'm out here on the side of my son's soccer training.
Okay.
And a lot of tension, but some of your answers, I mean, you're just so thoughtful and you're such a wonderful citizen. And I'm almost, this is going to sound kind of strange or mean, I'm almost grateful that you did file that complaint and it did prevent you from having a traditional kind of journalistic path, because I wonder if those limitations caused you to be such a force in the city in other ways. I don't know, maybe those things aren't mutually exclusive, but I think, I like the way things turned out for you, so to speak, and because how they turned out for us. And I'm coming in to wrap things up because I want to send this video and my thoughts, or have us write a letter, an email with our thoughts about your significance and how you can help us think about health inequities and social inequities in a relationship with medicine, or for medical practitioners as activists to make a difference, to make the kinds of differences that need to be made, not only in the clinic, but also in the community. And so if the group could hold on after you go off, I want to talk to them about it a bit, but I'm kind of at a loss for words and stumbling because it's overwhelming when I think about when I met you in 1988. And and what you were doing then, and just how you even generous and gracious with me as a young person just moving to Seattle, and that it never left me. You had an impact. So I've been cheering you on from afar for a very, very long time. And seeing, it's not that you're at the end of your life, but seeing this is a kind of culmination of all the work you've been doing so far, it's just kind of mind boggling. And I hope that these young people can catch that and catch that vision and see what an engaged single citizen who cares about community and social justice could do, the kind of impact they could have if they just commit to it and keep plugging along. It's
Yeah.
pretty miraculous, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for making this happen, Max. I remember that encounter as clearly as you do. So we were both destined to somehow intersect again. And I'm looking forward truly to continuing the conversation.
Okay,
We still owe each other lunch, right? At some
right.
juncture. So,
I owe you lunch. Mike and I owe you lunch big time.
okay. All right. Well, we'll
right.
find a date. All right.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. Take
All
care.
right. If the Seattle people
Thank
can
you.
to talk to you.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, Ron.
Okay.